It is 1861, and the most fashionable color in Europe is a brilliant, saturated, almost electric green. You see it everywhere in the drawing rooms and ballrooms of London and Paris, on dresses, on ribbons, on artificial flowers pinned to lapels and corsages, on the elaborate paper decorations hung at parties. It is a green unlike any color nature produces. Vivid, almost luminescent, the kind of green that makes every other green in the room look dull and tired by comparison. It is called emerald green, Scheele's green, Paris green, and it is made primarily from copper arsenite, one of the most toxic compounds in routine civilian use in the 19th century. The women who wore it were dying, slowly in some cases, quickly in others, and for decades, nobody in a position of authority did anything meaningful to stop it. This is the story of the most beautiful poison in Victorian fashion. To understand how an arsenic compound ended up woven into the fabric of European high society, you have to understand two things: the state of color chemistry in the early 19th century, and the particular hunger of the Victorian era for novelty and spectacle in dress. Before the development of synthetic dyes, the palette available to the textile industry was constrained by what nature provided. Natural dyes, derived from plants, insects, and minerals, produced a range of colors that were often beautiful but rarely brilliant. Greens, in particular, were notoriously difficult. The natural dyes that produced green tended to be unstable, fading unevenly with washing and light exposure, and the shades they yielded were muted rather than vivid. In 1775, a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele synthesized a new compound, copper arsenite. Mixed into a paste and applied to paper or fabric, it produced a green of extraordinary brightness and stability. It did not fade the way natural dyes faded. It did not shift color in different lights. It was, by the standards of its time, a revelation, and the industrial dye industry embraced it with the enthusiasm of an industry that had been waiting a very long time for exactly this. By the 1830s and 40s, Scheele's green, and its chemical variants, most importantly Paris green, a slightly different formulation that became the dominant commercial product, were being manufactured in industrial quantities and used across an enormous range of applications: wallpapers, candles, toys, bookbindings, artificial flowers, and above all, fabric. The endless yards of silk and muslin and taffeta that the Victorian fashion industry consumed in its relentless production of ball gowns, day dresses, evening wear, and accessories. The toxicity of arsenic was not a secret. Arsenic had been used as a poison for centuries. It was called inheritance powder in some parts of Europe because of its usefulness to people who wanted to accelerate the death of wealthy relatives. Medical texts of the period discussed its effects. Pharmacists sold it as a rat poison. The lethal dose for an adult human was well understood. The toxicity of arsenic was not a secret. Arsenic had been used as a poison for centuries. It was called inheritance powder in some parts of Europe because of its usefulness to people who wanted to accelerate the death of wealthy relatives. Medical texts of the period discussed its effects. Pharmacists sold it as a rat poison. The lethal dose for an adult human was well understood. What is perhaps most striking, in retrospect, is how early and how clearly the danger was identified, and how little that identification changed. In 1838, a British medical journal reported cases of illness in workers handling the dye. In 1842, a German physician connected a cluster of deaths in a household to the arsenical wallpaper in their rooms. The evidence was accumulating, systematically and in public, for decades before any meaningful response came. The gap between what was known and what was done is not a gap of ignorance. It is a gap of will. What was not well understood, or more precisely, what was understood by some and ignored by most, was that arsenic did not only kill when swallowed in concentrated form, it also killed, more slowly and more subtly, through skin absorption and inhalation. And the women who wore Paris green gowns were absorbing and inhaling it continuously. The mechanism was unpleasant in its elegance, The arsenical dye in the fabric was not chemically bonded to the fibers in a stable way. It sat in and on the fabric as particles that could be released by friction, by sweat, by the simple act of moving around in the dress. A woman dancing in a green silk ball gown was shedding microscopic arsenic particles into the air around her with every movement. She was breathing them in. They were settling on her skin, particularly in the warm, moist areas where fabric sat close to the body. If the dress included artificial flowers, a common decorative element in Victorian evening wear, those flowers were often made from fabric with even higher concentrations of the dye, held together with green-dyed paper and wire, and they sat inches from the face of whoever was wearing them. The symptoms of chronic arsenic exposure were, in the context of Victorian medicine, easy to misread: fatigue, skin irritation, hair loss, digestive problems, neurological symptoms, tingling in the extremities, weakness, difficulty concentrating. These were not unusual symptoms in an era without adequate nutrition, without clean water, without proper ventilation in homes heated by coal. A Victorian woman presenting these complaints to her doctor was far more likely to be diagnosed with nervousness, anemia, or general debility than with poisoning from her own dress. The dressmakers and artificial flower makers who worked with fabric and dye every day were in a far worse position than the women who merely wore the finished garments. These workers, overwhelmingly young women, working in the sweated trades of Victorian London, Paris, and Vienna, spent their days handling raw arsenical materials in enclosed workshops with no ventilation requirements and no awareness, in many cases, that what they were working with was dangerous. Their exposure was not the intermittent contact of a ball gown worn twice a month. It was 8 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for as long as they could work. The effects on the flower makers in particular were documented with increasing urgency throughout the 1850s and 60s by physicians who began to connect the patterns of illness in these workers with their occupation. Ulcerated skin on the hands and wrists, perforations of the nasal septum, the thin wall of cartilage between the nostrils, caused by inhaling arsenic dust, severe respiratory damage, neurological deterioration, death in the worst cases, in women who were sometimes as young as their early 20s. Physician named Arthur Hill Hassell published an analysis in 1862 arguing explicitly that the arsenical dyes in widespread commercial use were responsible for a pattern of illness that extended from the workers who made the goods to the consumers who bought them. His work was taken seriously in medical circles. It was largely ignored by the fashion industry. The industry's position, articulated by manufacturers, retailers, and the trade press with remarkable consistency across several decades, was that the danger was exaggerated, that arsenic in fabric wasn't absorbed through the skin in meaningful quantities, that the workers who were falling ill were constitutionally weak, that to abandon Paris green would be to abandon the commercial advantage it provided, and that the commercial advantage it provided was substantial enough to justify continuing to use it, while the science was, in their framing, still uncertain. The science was not uncertain. The science was increasingly unambiguous. What was uncertain was whether anyone with the power to act would do so. The eventual decline of Paris green in European fashion came not from a single regulatory intervention, but from a combination of factors accumulating through the 1870s and 80s, growing public awareness generated by a sustained campaign in the medical press, the development of aniline dyes that could produce comparable colors without arsenic, and the particular moment in 1879 when Queen Victoria's household issued guidance recommending against arsenical wallpapers in royal residences. When the Queen's household moved, the fashionable world noticed. By the 1890s, Paris green in fabric and domestic decoration was in significant decline in Britain and Western Europe. The regulations that eventually formalized this shift came slowly and patchwork. Different countries at different times, different applications covered differently, and enforcement was inconsistent for years beyond the initial legislation. The women who had worn the dresses and the workers who had made them had no legal recourse. The manufacturers who had known and said nothing faced no meaningful consequences. What Paris green leaves behind is a story that repeats itself with uncomfortable regularity across the history of industrial society. A substance that was beautiful, profitable, and widely used, whose danger was identified early by people who understood chemistry, whose dangers were then minimized by people who stood to lose money if they acknowledged them, and whose victims were overwhelmingly the people with the least power to protect themselves, the workers in the workshops, and, to a lesser extent, the consumers who trusted that what was sold to them was safe. The green dresses are gone. The color they produced, that particular electric, saturated, unfadable green, has never quite been matched by the synthetic dyes that replaced it. That is perhaps appropriate. Some colors should cost too much to use. And the next time you stand in a museum in front of a Victorian ball gown under glass, the fabric still vivid, the workmanship still extraordinary, the color still somehow alive after 150 years, remember that the dress outlasted the people who made it, as it always did.